So today I'm going to be talking about the Vietnam War, and more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the roots, the different conflicts that arose during the war, and some of the aftermath. So first we're going to be talking about the roots of the Vietnam War, and we're going to start off by talking about how France had control over Vietnam and other countries, and they gained this control in the Sino-French War, and this led to the creation of Indochina, which was France's colony. And then a little bit later in history, Ho Chi Minh created this Indochinese Communist Party in 1930, and this was the first sign of communism in Vietnam. And then a little bit later in 1940, Japanese troops invaded Indochina during the Second World War, and they took control of Vietnam. And lots of people tried to resist this occupation, both of the French and the Japanese, and so they created different organizations, such as the League of Independence of Vietnam. This is also known as the Viet Minh. And then Japan was actually defeated in World War II, and this led to them withdrawing from Vietnam. And so Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam as an independent nation, independent from southern Vietnam. And he resisted a French proposal for self government that was limited, and so this led to the French Indochina War. The French Indochina War lasted 8 years, and it ended in 1954 with this battle where the North ended up winning, and they created a treaty, and in the treaty, they created the 17th parallel, which is a line that separated the two powers, communism in the north under Ho Chi Minh and the state of Vietnam in the south. Ho Chi Minh, whenever he took over the northern part of Vietnam, he dethroned the emperor, and France brings back the exiled Emperor Bao Dai to lead the state of Vietnam in the south. And also in the treaty, the two sides agree that elections were to be held within 2 years to unify Vietnam back into one unified country, but this actually never ends up happening. And then in 1955, Diem, who was a Catholic nationalist, emerges and he dethrones Bao and becomes the new president. And he calls his new form of government the government of the Republic of Vietnam, and he gets help from the United States with this. So here on this slide, we've got some pictures of the leaders of Vietnam during this time. On the left, there's Ho Chi Minh, and then there's Bao Dai, and then Diem on the right. So I've been talking a lot about Indochina and France and other countries that have had a role in this, but I haven't mentioned anything about the United States. So what role does the United States play in all of this? The US gave tremendous amounts of aid to the French during this time. And so in March of 1947, Truman makes an address to Congress, stating that the United States has a duty to assist any country whose stability is threatened by communism. And this is later called the Truman Doctrine. And this fear of communism that arises from the Cold War is what drives him to create this doctrine. In June of 1950, the US identified the Viet Minh as a threat, and so they decided to set up military assistance in Vietnam. And this is whenever they really start to make an impact in Vietnam. And then in April of 1954, Dwight D. Eisenhower talked about the domino theory. In 1961, John F. Kennedy advises a buildup of American military in Vietnam to help combat the Viet Cong. And this mostly has to do with the domino theory. This is a theory that was put together by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it states that if one Asian country in the Southeast was to fall to communism, many other countries would follow. And the root to this domino theory was the fear of communism that came from the Cold War. And so, due to the domino theory, more and more troops were stationed in Vietnam. And by 1962, there had already been 9,000 troops in South Vietnam. And then there were also many organizations that were created as a result of the domino theory, and one of these is SEATO. With the Cold War intensifying worldwide, the United States hardens its policies against any allies of the Soviet Union so that they can get a head start in stopping the spread of communism. And so, to jumpstart with this, the American military, the CIA, and South Vietnam's forces arrest Viet Minh sympathizers in South Vietnam. And because of this, and due to conflicts arising, opponents of the Viet Cong and even the Viet Cong, they begin fighting back and forth and having attacks on government officials starting in 1957. And by 1959, there are even firefights between both sides. And then in 1960, of the month of December, the National Liberation Front is created, and this was created by both communist and non-communist opponents to the South Vietnam to resist the regime. During the Vietnam War, John F. Kennedy was elected as president, and during his presidency, Vietnam was America's greatest international commitment. And Kennedy believed that scheduling the elections was a trap, and this had something to do with the Bay of Pigs, and that he just was very skeptical about everything, kind of indecisive of what to do about Vietnam. But his first initiative was in 1961, and he sent in the first group of US troops into Vietnam. But then later in November 1st of 1963, he authorizes an anti-Diem coup to kill Diem. And this was one of the first big mistakes that the US makes during the Vietnam War. And then just 3 weeks later, he's assassinated in Dallas, Texas. In August of 1964, the USS Maddox is allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. And this is actually later disputed, but as a result of thinking that it actually happened, Johnson, who takes over for Kennedy, calls an airstrike bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. And Congress passes this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorizes the president to take all necessary measures, including the use of armed force, against any aggressor in the conflict that is happening in Vietnam. And so then President Johnson launches a 3-year campaign in bombing targets in North Vietnam, and this is called Operation Rolling Thunder. And this has to do a lot with the Juniper Complex, where people have a fear of communism and the spread of communism, and they believe that if they take out anyone who has any association with communism, then it will stop the spread of it. And many professionals believe that this bombing in Vietnam was the cheaper option, and that sending in troops would have been a better option, sending troops into North Vietnam rather than just bombing North Vietnam and killing many civilians. March through June of 1965, Johnson sends even more troops into Vietnam, and this reaches over 82,000 troops in Vietnam. And this even gets a little bit worse whenever in 1968, the Tet Offensive begins. And this is where Viet Minh and North Vietnamese armies attack 100 cities and towns all across Vietnam, mostly South Vietnam, and they massacre hundreds upon thousands of people. But the US and South Vietnamese forces strike back quickly, which was very surprising and was a turning point in the war in the beginning of a gradual US withdrawal from the region. But what was really surprising is that the media responds to the attack with a Viet Cong victory and the US having a loss, which I find to be odd. But after all of this, Nixon wins the 1968 election, right after Johnson is trying to bring about all this peace with North Vietnam and this new peace track. But Nixon brings about Vietnamization, which is this gradual withdrawal of US troops, but at the same time increasing bombardment on the North Vietnamese armies to try and get ahead in the war, but then also training the South Vietnamese armies so that they can fend for themselves whenever we're withdrawing. And so Nixon continues these peace talks, but just like Johnson's, they continue to stall. In 1968, U.S. soldiers slaughtered over 400 unarmed civilians in the village of My Lai, and this happens amid a campaign of U.S. search and destroy operations that are intended to find enemy territories, destroy them, and then retreat. And then before and especially after this campaign, anti-war protests continue to build up in the U.S. And in November of 1969, the largest anti-war demonstration in U.S. history occurred in Washington. And the anti-war movement was really, really strong, especially on college campuses and especially among the youth. And this even led to the Kent State shooting, where 4 students were killed during a demonstration. And then withdrawals are continuing to happen, and this leads to a lot of dishonorable discharges due to people being angry that they're not being discharged with everyone else, and it even leads to draftees during this time fleeing the country because they don't want to be drafted into the war and going into Vietnam during this time. And so in 1970, South Vietnamese troops with the US invade Laos in an attempt to stop the North Vietnamese that are in Laos. And then December of 1972, there are the Christmas bombings. And this was a ton of bombings that happened in North Vietnam during December of that year. So when did the war actually end? It seems that there's been a lot of conflict, but no resolution. The war lasted over 20 years. And in 1973, a final peace agreement was made between the US and North Vietnam. So this ended the conflict between the US and Vietnam. But the war continued between the North and South in Vietnam until April of 1975, whenever the North captured Saigon, which was the South capital. The Vietnamese suffered so many casualties during this time. 2 million were killed, 3 million wounded, and 12 million civilians escaped as refugees. After the war, it was followed by reconstruction in Vietnam, and by 1976, Vietnam was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. But there was sporadic violence that continued due to the conflicts that were still there between Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. And the US involvement led to inflation because more than $120 billion was spent towards the Vietnam effort by the US. And there were physical and psychological damage to the people that went there because of how divided the nation was. Many people faced reactions from opponents of the war who viewed them as having killed innocent civilians and people who saw it as having lost the war. But then they also had physical damages from exposure to toxic herbicides like Agent Orange. Overall, the war was very, very bloody and something that is somewhat controversial.